guys do. Explore what's all on their minds. Yeah, not a thing or two, or about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I can be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, this week, our topic could not be any bigger. The topic is happiness, something which properly should concern every last one of our listeners. And when I was listening to a podcast fairly recently, I was really struck by an assertion of a guest on that podcast who said that statistically speaking, conservatives are more likely to report themselves as happy than liberals. And that really ran contrary to my expectations because I think we've all been in a political landscape over the last few years in which conservatives come across, at least within public displays, as angry or fearful or suspicious or outraged. And none of that really sounds to me like happiness. And so I was really interested in going deeper into this, understanding what studies that guests might have been citing, what measures of happiness he might have been thinking about. And so I set you off to do that with the question, is it in fact true that liberals are less happy than conservatives in America? What measures of happiness might that guest have been citing? And if the data does suggest that liberals are less happy, what might be at the root of that? So I can't wait to hear what you learned.
Yeah, well, I learned a lot, and it's a ton of information I had to digest in order to spit this back out at you. And I'm still not sure I have a great handle on it, Mark, but I'm going to do my best here.
Okay.
I like to start, as you know, sometimes with a short answer because it serves as a roadmap for my presentation. And I think that would be useful here, given the morass of information. The consensus of the research I reviewed is that conservatives are happier than liberals. But the answer to your second question about why, that's the part that lacks consensus.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get into all that in due course. But first, let's do some level setting about the concept of happiness. Going back to the 1970s, sociologists, psychologists, economists, and other academics have done annual surveys of Americans to ask whether they're happy, and those surveys come back with consistent results. For example, people who are physically healthy tend to be happier than people who aren't healthy. That's not particularly surprising. Women are happier than men. Married women are happier than married men. Single women are happier than single men, and widowed women are happier than widowed men. That sounds like a trend, huh?
Yeah, I see a trend line in there for sure. Yeah. My concern was that you were going to say that widowed women were the happiest of them all. When they were finally free of the shackles of that man in their life. And I'm happy. I'm happier that you arrived where you did.
Yeah, well, that may actually be true, but I didn't look into that particular question. According to the Harvard economics professor Arthur Brooks, one of the world's leading experts on the science of human happiness, about 30% of the American public say they're very happy. Slightly over 50% say they're somewhat happy, and about 10 to 15% say they're not happy. So Americans, by and large, are a happy lot.
Well, may I just throw in the caveat, they say they're happy.
Yes.
And I hope that we'll be getting deeper into that.
Yes, good point, and we will be getting deeper into that. Here are a few other findings from Arthur Brooks's analysis of various happiness surveys. 48% of happiness is genetic and therefore out of our control. And that data comes from a fascinating study of identical twins separated at birth. 40% of happiness derives from big life events, both good and bad, which are only somewhat in our control. The final 12% is firmly in our control, and Brooks breaks that into 4 components: faith, family, community, which he defines as friendships and charitable behavior, and work. The last one may seem counterintuitive to some, since so much of public discourse about work focuses on how it's such a drag. But in most surveys, nearly 90% of Americans say they're either somewhat or completely satisfied with their jobs. Brooks maintains that it's what he calls earned success, the belief that you're creating value and meaning with your life and serving the lives of others. That's key to happiness. Put a pin in that for now, because we're going to come back to it in connection with conservatives and liberals.
Okay. Can I quickly ask, when you said faith, is that specifically religious faith, or is it a more abstract concept than that?
It's religious faith, and I'm going to say more about that as we dive into the statistics.
Okay.
But before that, I want to say a little about the podcast episode you referenced in your question. The host of Plain English, Derek Thompson, was speaking to the political scientist and former pastor Ryan Burge, whose work centers on analyzing data about religion and politics. Thompson asked Burge about the statistical happiness benefit conferred by religion and why it's grown in recent decades. Burge replied in part as follows, quote, "I think it's also tied up with liberalism versus conservatism. Liberals are not as happy as conservatives. Like, you can cut the data however you want. You can control for whatever you want. You can do whatever fancy math you want. Conservatives are happier than liberal people are." End quote. That's the quote that stopped you in your tracks, and I can understand why. Since the 1950s, researchers have studied the relationship between personality and political ideology, and there are numerous studies going back decades suggesting that, quote, "conservatives are more dogmatic and intolerant of ambiguity, higher in needs for order, structure, and closure, lower in self-esteem, higher in fear of threat and loss, and prefer less complex modes of thinking. Even children in nursery school who 20 years later self-identify as conservatives have been described as fearful, rigid, inhibited, and vulnerable." End quote. Now, that's pretty much what I see in the conservatives I know. And yet, despite their fearfulness and ideological rigidity, study after study indicates that conservatives are happier and more satisfied with their lives than liberals.
Well, the same caveat as before, conservatives report being happier than liberals.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm glad you flagged that, because we are going to dive into that.
Yeah, because I also dug into this, and the one thing that leapt out to me is so much of this is self-reported, and yet when it's communicated to the public, it's not in terms of these people say they're happy. It's reported as these people are happy.
Yes.
As if it's definitive and
yes,
and verified in some objective fashion. And I think that's a really critical thing that I learned when I was digging into it, that I hope we convey to our listeners, is that this is self-reported.
Yes.
Which comes with all of the complications there.
Yes, you're quite right. And yet, you need to just take my word for this, Mark. There is a consensus that conservatives are happier. People accept this data. Beginning with the next person I'm going to mention, there's a sociologist named Musa Al-Gharbi. He summarized all the social science on this topic. And as I said, there's reams and reams of it. And this is the way he put it. Quote, "It's a scientific fact that conservatives tend to be happier and more well-adjusted than liberals. The implications and applications of these realities remain wide open to interpretation." End quote. And to his last point, I found that much of the interpretation is itself tainted by political polarization, with liberal academics characterizing conservatives' happiness as somehow pathological, while conservative researchers seem convinced that liberal ideology either derives from mental illness or at least exacerbates existing psychological distress. I found myself checking all those writers' credentials to glean what side of the partisan divide they were on. I'm going to say a lot more about those battling explanations, but again, the headline here is that conservatives are measurably happier than liberals, and the only real argument is why. Ryan Burge and the other researchers who work in this area are relying on studies and polls that consistently find that American conservatives report higher levels of happiness and life satisfaction than American liberals. And yes, Mark, as you just pointed out, I did accent the word report for reasons we'll discuss later. Researchers measure this so-called ideological happiness gap via polling, mental health assessments, and life satisfaction surveys. The happiness gap is visible across all age groups and has been present since the inception of such polling in the early to mid-1970s. So that's 50 plus years. For that entire period, there's been a 10 to 20% gap between the share of conservatives versus liberals who report being very happy. Incidentally, this phenomenon is not limited to Americans. Social psychologists Olga Stavrova and Mike A. Luhman studied 92 countries from 1981 through 2014 and found that, quote, liberals were happier than conservatives in only 5 out of the 92 countries and never in the United States, end quote. Brad Wilcox, a sociologist and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, published a piece for the Conservative Institute for Family Studies in which he reviewed the results of the 2022 American Family Survey. Wilcox described how liberals, especially liberal women, were 15% less likely to be completely satisfied with their lives and nearly 20% less likely to indicate complete satisfaction with their mental health compared to their conservative peers aged 18 to 55. A completely different survey done the same year, the 2022 Cooperative Election Study, or CES, surveyed 60,000 voters and achieved a similar result. Of the people reporting their mental health as excellent, conservatives outnumber liberals 51% to 20%, while liberals outnumber conservatives 45% to 19% among voters saying they have poor mental health. Everyone's favorite numbers geek, Nate Silver, sliced and diced the CES results and found that the happiness gap persisted across all demographics, from gender to race to age to education to income to religion to sexual orientation to marriage and children's status. All species of conservatives are happier than all species of liberals. According to Brad Wilcox, 2 factors explain a lot of this happiness gap: marital status and family satisfaction. Conservatives in the target age group of 18 to 55 are about 20% more likely to be married and 18% more likely to be satisfied with their families, strongly suggesting that marriage and family are correlated with one's happiness and mental health. Now, I must say that's certainly true for me personally. I became a much happier person after I got married, and I felt more fulfilled after having kids. Wilcox thinks that many liberals, quote, have embraced the false narrative that the path to happiness runs counter to marriage and family life, not towards it. They think independence, freedom, and work will make them happy, end quote. Among the aged 18 to 55 cohort, 55% of conservatives are married compared to 41% of liberals. 44% of conservatives attend a church, temple, synagogue, or mosque at least once a month, as opposed to 18% of liberals. Writing in the New York Times, Wilcox and his fellow researchers, Hal Boyd and Wendy Wang, said the happiness gap isn't explained by differences in race, gender, age, or income, but that, quote, once we control for marriage, parenthood, family satisfaction, religious attendance, and community satisfaction, the ideological gap in happiness disappears. Liberals who are married, parents, religiously active, and happy with their family and community are all significantly more likely than other liberals to report that they are very happy, end quote.
Do these researchers that you're talking about, do they look at satisfaction versus happiness? Because those aren't exactly the same thing. And I wonder if just how nuanced they are in their consideration of those two things.
Yes. The answer is that there are different gradations for the study. There's happiness, there's family satisfaction, there's emotional stability, which I'm going to mention in a couple minutes. And they're all a little different, as you point out. But the consensus seems to be that conservatives score more highly on all those measures.
Yeah, I'm not doubting that they are related to each other. But if anything is passed off as, well, satisfaction equates to happiness, that's not exactly the same thing.
Yes.
Particularly if we're talking self-reporting. And maybe you'll have more to say on this later. I plan on circling back around once you're done. But
okay.
I think that those two things are related to each other in interesting ways.
Yeah, it's true that they're different. I guess all I'm saying is whether you're measuring satisfaction or stability or happiness, whatever word you use, conservatives are reporting higher levels of it than liberals are.
Right.
The happiness gap is not just reflected in public opinion polling. Epidemiologists and psychologists have noticed a gap in quote-unquote depressive attitudes between conservative and liberal teenagers over the past 2 decades, with a spike beginning in 2012. And we don't have time here to discuss what happened in 2012, but that would make for a great episode of Mansplaining with the keywords social media. There seem to be more people with depression on the ideological left. Tufts University's 2022 Equity in America survey indicated that 5% of its respondents identified as extremely liberal, but 14% of the people diagnosed with depression were extremely liberal, whereas conservatives comprised 18.5% of the sample, but just 11% of those with diagnosed depression. Is this ironclad evidence that depressed people are clustered on the left, or might it be that people who employ the label of depression are left-leaning? Other studies tell us that although liberal girls were significantly more depressed than liberal boys, ideological differences dwarfed gender differences, with liberal boys more likely to disclose depression than conservatives of either gender.
Right. There's an interesting, I think, cause and effect question to this, or a chicken and the egg, which is that you've got liberals more depressed. And so is depression a function of liberalism, or does liberalism lead you to depression because of less satisfaction with the way things are in the world, right?
Yes.
Because if you've got a liberal mindset, then you're probably much more bothered by what's going on in Palestine than conservatives. You're much more bothered by police brutality than conservatives are. You're much more bothered by the way the world is today than conservatives, who probably have more a mindset that things are as they should be. And so your satisfaction is going to be quite a bit lower, and you're going to be depressed about the way things are and the unlikelihood that things are ever going to get better. And so that's where satisfaction and happiness are linked in, I think, super interesting ways, where satisfaction isn't a measure of happiness, in my view, so much as it is a generator of happiness. Like if you're satisfied with your situation or with the world as it is, that makes you more inclined to feel happy with the way it is. But that doesn't mean that it's anything native to your situation in the world. It's just a reaction to the world. Like, I am satisfied with my life and therefore I'm happy, or I'm satisfied with white male dominance of the world and therefore I'm happy. And it cuts against this notion that liberalism produces unhappiness because of what liberalism is rather than what liberalism causes you to identify as important within your world.
Yeah. So the through line I'm hearing with you is deep suspicion of these findings. And once again, you've anticipated something I am going to talk about. There is some research pushing back against the narrative that I'm painting right now.
Mm-hmm.
But the order in which I'm taking this is just to kind of lay out all the facts and try to describe to the best of my ability this consensus before we talk more about why this might be.
Another thing I was thinking about is that if you think liberal versus conservative in this country, a lot of the time you're talking urban versus rural, where progressives tend to be in larger urban communities.
Right.
Which has a bunch of correlated effects. But the one I'm thinking of is that if you live in a big city, you are just in contact with so many more people. So many people who are different from you, some people who are much more affluent than you are, or more beautiful than you are, or more evidently successful than you are. And as they always say, comparison is the thief of joy. I feel like urban living puts us in a position of comparing ourselves to others in a way which can rob us of the joy that we might experience if we lived in much smaller communities and just were comparing ourselves to people who are so much more similar to ourselves because those communities are more homogeneous. And so I think there's an interesting possibility that just living in the sort of city where progressives tend to live creates an environment that sort of saps our satisfaction and therefore our happiness.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and that's an interesting point, but I didn't read anything about studies in that area. And also, just to push back a little, yes, you're in the city, you're in close proximity to more beautiful people or richer people, but you're also in close proximity to world-class parks and restaurants and museums. And if anything, that should make you more happy than the typical person who's living out in rural America, 20 minutes away from nothing.
I'm not sure that's true. If you listen to people in rural areas, they don't speak about their deprivation, their lack of culture and their lack of museums. Like they find things in that community that satisfies them. So I'm not sure that the inability to get to the Museum of Modern Art is really cutting away at the happiness of rural people. I think definitely it's an attraction if you're in New York or Chicago, whatever, that you have those things. But I don't think that those are happiness engines the way you seem to suggest.
Okay, well, we can agree to disagree on that point. But as I'm teasing out these strands of data, I think some of the potential explanations for the happiness gap are already beginning to emerge. There are positive correlations for marriage, parenthood, and church attendance. There are negative correlations for mental health status. Conservatives are also consistently more patriotic than liberals, even when Donald Trump isn't the president. And there's research about how that confers a greater feeling of well-being. Conservatives are more rooted in established social institutions than liberals are, and that makes a measurable difference in terms of happiness and life satisfaction. As Brad Wilcox puts it, quote, being integrated into core institutions of American life like marriage and faith is a big reason. We are social animals, and when we are connected to other people, we tend to be much more likely to flourish, end quote. Again, as far as I'm concerned, there's no argument there. It's human connection that gives meaning and direction to our lives. Having or making meaning in one's life is no small thing. The Colorado State psychologist Michael Steger described his research on this subject to Thomas Edsall of the New York Times as follows, quote, what we feel confident in is that when people have a strong purpose that they care about and take steps to manifest, they say life is more meaningful and that they are happier, more helpful, and more resilient as well, end quote. Steger argues that it's easier for conservatives to get there than it is for liberals. Quote, The higher level of meaning we see among conservatives is tied to ideas around certainty and consistency. This shows up somewhat convincingly in religious commitment, which is higher among conservatives and is related to more meaning in life. Consistency helps us feel that we have made sense of our experience, which is a critical dimension of meaning in life. Having a worldview that works and never needs to change would be beneficial from the perspective of meaning in life, end quote. Liberals, on the other hand, quote, appear to place higher value on being open-minded and questioning, as well as on being future-oriented. This can leave them vulnerable to uncertainty and to having less solidity at the core of their worldviews, end quote. In other words, liberals search for meaning in their lives, and that search sometimes leaves them distressed, while conservatives don't need to search for meaning because it's already baked into their religious and family-centric views.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. In the episodes where we've focused on religion, I think I've raised the point before that religion gives you a sense of community and also meaning and purpose to your life. It answers many of life's big questions for you.
Yes.
And that can be a precious resource. It certainly was for my mother during her life, is that it was a primary sense of community for her.
Yes, and I didn't mention this, Mark, but just let me add, I read a bunch of studies that suggested that church-going and religious commitment is more compelling to your sense of meaning and belonging than things that liberals do, like book clubs or salons.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
It's just measurably, there's a greater connection to the community and church attendance.
Right. Yeah, a book club is something you dip into and dip out of. Like there's no sense of lifelong commitment to a book club the way you get from a church.
Yes.
But I think there's a certain irony to that being a prescriptive element within this research that, oh yeah, you should go to church because then the church will give you this sense of meaning and purpose and lifelong commitment. And it's just simply not that easy, is it?
Right.
Like if you don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, you can't just show up and suddenly have faith. You know, that's something that is hard to get to. And I'm not sure that just showing up on Sunday and sitting in the pews is going to have that effect of meaning and purpose if you're not able to get that faith injection. And I don't know where that faith is going to come from if you're not already feeling it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'm not religious myself, but I do feel like there are things that I do that connect me with my community that are alternatives to religious belief. But the research is suggesting that the many millions of people who have religion in their lives have this pillar of community connection that's very meaningful to them and directly translates to happiness. And I don't doubt that. It's not for me, but I don't begrudge them that genuine happiness.
I think in my mind, if I think of it in terms of satisfaction, I have an easier time with it for some reason. And that probably says something more about me. That, yes, that being a member of a church and believing that Jesus died for your sins is going to give you a feeling of satisfaction. It is going to make you feel like everything is fundamentally right with the world and that it will turn out okay because God's looking over things. And that is not the path I've ever been on. Mine is much more like what you described of the liberal, search for meaning, the asking of questions.
Right.
And yes, that is not always something that is satisfying. But I would also, 100 days out of 100, I would argue for the legitimacy and the importance of that search rather than simply sitting back and letting someone else tell you what the meaning of your life is.
All right. Well, I'm not going to make you any happier with the next thing I'm going to say, but there's another wrinkle I want to add on this feeling of connection. There's a separate study of the happiness gap in which the psychologists Barry R. Schlenker, John Chambers, and Bonnie Lay state that conservatives, compared to liberals, express greater personal control and responsibility over their lives. They have a more positive outlook reflected in things like optimism and self-worth. They have more transcendent moral beliefs measured by greater religiosity and moral clarity and less tolerance of transgressions. and they have what they call a generalized belief in fairness. So I want to parse some of those differences. Conservatives define fairness in terms of equitable outcomes proportional to contributions, while for liberals, fairness is about equal outcomes regardless of contributions. For conservatives, spiritual beliefs, Schlenker and his colleagues argue, quote, contribute to life satisfaction because they instill meaning and direction, offer senses of beauty, uplift, and optimism, provide explanations for events, give a sense of closeness to God, and offer comfort in difficult times. And these characteristics are above and beyond the larger supportive social networks of those who are religious, end quote. By contrast, the researchers identified liberals' disengagement from faith and family. Quote, liberals have become less happy over the last several decades, but this decline is associated with increasingly secular attitudes and actions. For example, less religiosity, less likelihood of being married, and perhaps lessened belief in personal agency, end quote. When it comes to responsibility, conservatives see social justice as consistent with binding moral foundations, emphasizing things like personal agency, while liberals are much more likely to point to factors beyond one's personal control, like luck. The researchers conclude that, quote, perceptions of internal control, self-efficacy, and the engagement in meaningful work are strongly related to life satisfaction. These differences in personal agency could, in and of themselves, explain much of the happiness gap, end quote. In short, if you think you're the architect of your own destiny, you're likely to be happier. Conservatives see themselves that way. Liberals don't.
Yeah, I think that's entirely consistent. There's a sense within conservative social media it's pretty obvious that they are the masters of their domain, the kings of their castle.
Yes.
They flex in that direction. And so that seems entirely consistent that it would be pervasive within the community, maybe not in as overt a fashion, but still a core element.
Yes. And there's one other point I want to make. It may seem obvious, but there's an old saying about George H.W. Bush. Somebody mentioned this at one of the Democratic conventions. It was a big laugh line. He was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple, right?
Yes.
So whether you believe you're the architect of your destiny or, like many liberals, it's just the luck of your birth, right? You're born in the United States to a wealthy family as opposed to being born in South Sudan in poverty, right? We're not really adjudicating here which one is correct or closer to correct. We're simply saying that if you're born on third base and think you hit a triple, you're probably likelier to be happy and report yourself as happy as somebody who thinks the world is terribly unfair because some people are born on third base and think they hit a triple.
Right.
That's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. And it circles back to what we were talking about before, is if your worldview inclines you to think that things are as they should be and that you're meant to be on third base because that's what you deserve, then you're going to express greater satisfaction with the world as it is and with your place within that world. And that probably correlates with self-reported happiness. Yeah.
Yes. Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us. Because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform, and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really. Okay, I want to say one more thing on the research, and then I'm going to pivot to some of the pushback, and that I think is going to be very welcome from your perspective, Mark. So research has suggested that personality differences like higher levels of emotional stability, which I teased earlier, or lower neuroticism on the part of conservatives may also contribute to the happiness gap. I want to focus on neuroticism for a minute. Though conservatives are measurably more likely to perceive external threats to society, they are less likely to perceive internal threats to their personal lives. Neuroticism is defined by psychologists as the chronic tendency to experience negative emotions like anxiety, depression, anger, and emotional instability. Neurotic people perceive ordinary situations as threatening. They struggle to manage stress, and they're intensely self-critical. Studies show a negative correlation between conservatism and neuroticism and suggest that, as one put it, quote, the happiness differential between liberals and conservatives can be largely accounted for by differences in their mean levels of emotional stability, end quote. Not all scholars are on board with these explanations. Remember when I said that conservatives report higher levels of happiness than liberals, and I emphasized the word report, as did you, Mark? That's because there's research suggesting that self-reported subjective measurements don't tell the full story about happiness and well-being because they're, quote, susceptible to self-enhancing distortions, end quote. Self-enhancement is associated with politically conservative ideology in that it's more pronounced among religious people, individualistic cultures, and super-competitive hierarchically oriented groups. Meanwhile, behavioral studies drawn from large samples of online survey takers, U.S. politicians, LinkedIn, and Twitter users indicate that liberals use more positive emotional language in their speech, and they smile more intensely and genuinely in photographs. It's called Duchenne smiling, analogous to the Duchenne laughter we discussed in episode 50 of this podcast, Why We Laugh. These studies suggest that liberals are more likely than conservatives to display signs of genuine happiness, and that the happiness gap might be due to conservatives' tendency for self-aggrandizement. One team of researchers wrote in the journal Science, quote, our studies found that political liberals exhibited more frequent and intense happiness-related behavior than political conservatives, end quote. Liberals were also found to be more self-aware, meaning that when they say they're happy, it's more likely to be true.
Right.
Does that resonate more with you?
Yeah, well, what I wish was more prevalent within all these studies was just a more nuanced treatment of self-reporting, because that is in its own right, particularly when we're talking about something like happiness, it's such a fraught thing because we mean different things when we say happiness.
Yes.
We wonder what people will think of us if we say we're unhappy. Like, it's not an easy question. Are you happy? Like, are you happy in this moment? Are you happy in your life? Are you happy about your future? Are you happy with what has happened to you so far? Those are all different questions, and I suspect that the polling did not ask those in a way where they're really getting into that. I think a frustration for me is that it's very interesting to ask people if they're happy, but that's the beginning of the conversation. If they say, oh, yeah, I'm happy, that's not the end of the conversation. There's a whole lot of meat in between those two things.
Yeah.
And that podcast where the guy says, no matter how you slice the data, liberals are less happy than conservatives, there's a lot of nuance there that he was glossing over in a way that I feel does a disservice to the importance of the question.
Yeah, well, neither he nor I are doing justice to all the crosstabs in those surveys, you know? Mm-hmm. But also, just to be devil's advocate for a second, since we're on this subject now, Your suspicion could be applied to any survey of anything.
Yeah.
If they ask you whether you ate steak or green salad last night,
Right.
that's equally subject to the biases and distortions of self-reporting,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Well, sure.
Or who you voted for in the last election.
Sure, but what is the value of a report that you're sending out to the public if you're couching it in terms where it's almost certainly can be misunderstood? They say that if you're married, you're more likely to be happy. But does marriage make you happy, or are happier people more likely to get married? Like if someone is deeply unhappy, they're probably not going to date very successfully.
Yes.
They're not going to come across as a good mate. They're less likely to get married. And so some element of that correlation between marriage and happiness is complicated by the fact that unhappy people are less likely to get married. And yet, again, that doesn't surface within the data, within the reports.
Right.
I know it's there in the data. They're just not talking about it in a way that makes me frustrated with the entire enterprise.
Yeah, it's a fair point. All right, well, let's see what you think about this. Some other academics accept the reality of the happiness gap, but they posit that it's driven by differences in how liberals and conservatives think about politics generally and inequality specifically. And this gets back to another point you made earlier. For instance, the NYU psychologists Jamie Napier and John Jost co-authored a paper in which they argued that after controlling for income, marital status, and church attendance, it's system justification that explains why conservatives are happier than liberals. System justification is a theory in social psychology proposing that people are highly motivated to defend and justify existing social, economic, and political systems. Such people have a psychological need to see the world as an orderly and just meritocracy, and the status quo as fair or even desirable, regardless of whether it's flawed or even if it disadvantages them, because it serves to reduce threat and uncertainty, which harkens back to the research on conservatives being fearful of threat or loss. In other words, conservatives' happiness with the existing social order is at least partially about rationalizing the inequality they see in the world and justifying the suffering of disadvantaged groups, either by blaming the victim or telling themselves that everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed. When confronted by evidence of income or healthcare disparities between white and black people, conservatives tolerate the disparities or at least have an ideological buffer that insulates them from confronting such disparities, while liberals ruminate over them, believing they're intolerable, thereby producing a difference in happiness between the two groups.
Yeah.
Napier and Jost add that rising levels of inequality in recent decades have only exacerbated this happiness gap.
Yeah. To that mix, I would add prosperity gospel, which was big in evangelical circles over the last few decades, where the notion is that you are successful because God loves you.
Yeah.
And your success is a function of God's love. And so that's a deeply ideological, theological way of justifying existing disparities as saying it's God's will. And that if God wanted it to be different, he'd have made it different. And so therefore we should not question the fact that Jeff Bezos has so many billions of dollars, because that is the world that God created.
Right.
And if you want to be successful, then pray. And if God loves you, you'll be successful. And so it's a real tautology. It's a snake swallowing its tail, which serves the function of justifying the way things are.
Also strikes me as not a noxious ideology for anybody who is not having a good experience in their lives, to be saddled with the idea that God wants it that way. That's just awful. So here's what I thought of when I read this research about system justification. I have a T-shirt that I wear occasionally that has an illustration on it that I think inadvertently explains system justification. It's a drawing of 3 fish swimming in line. In the back is a big fish with its mouth wide open, with a thought bubble above it that says, the world is just. Right in front of it, almost inside the open mouth of the big fish, is a medium-sized fish, also with its mouth wide open. Above it is a thought bubble that says, there is some justice in the world. In front of it, almost inside the open mouth of the medium-sized fish, is a small fish whose mouth is closed. The thought bubble over it says, there is no justice in the world. Conservatives, whether they're oligarchs or working stiffs, identify with the big fish, while liberals, whether they have Kennedy money or no money, identify with the small fish.
Yeah, or at least have empathy for the small fish, right?
Right.
And I think one knock-on effect of that is knowing that there are small fish out there for whom there is no justice in the world. It makes it harder to say that you're happy, doesn't it? Because implicit in that is that you are happy living in a world that has small fish for which there is no justice in the world. You know,
yes.
It kind of relates to how I felt recently, you know, with the current administration, where I feel guilty about any expression of satisfaction because that implies a sort of backdoor endorsement of things that are so difficult for people who are not like me. And so Trump being in the White House makes it harder for me to say I'm happy, not because I'm unhappy about Trump, though I am, but because I am uncomfortable with the notion of being identified as happy in a world where Trump is in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason I presented this system justification theory last is because it's the most interesting to me. Mm-hmm. You know, it acknowledges the reality of the happiness gap while positing an idea that could explain a lot of why conservatives are happier. They tolerate more crap in the world than liberals do.
Right.
So I have a few concluding thoughts. Here's the first. While I'm persuaded by my review of the research that the happiness gap between conservatives and liberals is a real phenomenon, I don't know what to do with all these disparate and contradictory research findings about the reason for the gap. I'm a liberal, so I'd love to believe that my group's happiness deficit stems from its laudable inclination to care too much and take the weight of the world on our shoulders. But who knows? All the explanations I recited sound plausible, so maybe it's a little bit of everything. The one thing I feel quite sure about is that who's happier or less happy is not an immutable characteristic for individuals or political tribes, and so the researchers who are closest to correct are the ones who accommodate variability. For example, rather than arguing for the permanence of conservative bliss, Colorado State's Michael Steger makes a more nuanced argument that who's happier might depend on whose political party is in power. Quote, it seems very likely that to the extent that liberals have personalized equality, equity, fairness, environmental stewardship, or other issues associated with liberalism, the more susceptible they are to distress as progress toward the satisfaction of those goals is blocked. The same general idea would pertain to conservatives who have personalized conservative political goals that are seen as blocked. So one idea here is the stronger the purpose, the greater the benefit when you are making progress, and the greater the anguish when you are not. End quote. Now, that quote certainly explains why conservatives are happier than liberals today, but were significantly less happy when the last guy was president. Along those same lines, all the surveys and studies I've presented today capture a snapshot of the electorate. But electorates change. The racial electorate changed profoundly over time, with Black Americans voting solidly Republican for nearly a century after Reconstruction before switching to the Democratic Party for the last half century. Similarly, the happiness electorate is also changing. Less economically and less emotionally stable working class voters used to be the base of support for liberal coalitions, but have drifted conservative in recent decades. While college-educated white-collar workers with their purposeful jobs and stable marriages used to be the conservative base, but are increasingly identifying as liberals. As these changes take place, which coalition's voters report more happiness in surveys will also change, and the happiness gap might go away. That's my admittedly unsure take, Mark. What do you think?
I think happiness is one of the most fraught questions. Like when I first asked you this a couple of weeks ago, I thought it was a much easier question than it actually turns out to have been. The more I went into this, the more I problematized.
Yes.
Where it seems to me so difficult to actually get a really good answer to the question, are you happy? Because, like here's one thing that you didn't bring up that I've been thinking about a little bit, which is like so much of happiness is related to what your expectations were in life, right? If you think that success in life means that you have a good job, a good family, and a house in the suburbs with a white picket fence with a dog barking in the backyard, and then you don't get that, maybe because you live in New York City and home ownership is just economically unfeasible, then that cuts away at your happiness, but not necessarily because your circumstances are bad, but because it doesn't line up with what your expectations were. But on the flip side, if you live in the suburbs or in the country where you can have all those things, you can have your job, you can have your family, you can have the house with the white picket fence, and someone asks, are you happy? Your answer might have to do more with, well, my life followed the plan that I thought it was going to follow, and therefore I must be happy with how things turned out. And again, that might not necessarily equate to how you feel in your heart, but your expectations and your reality line up well, and therefore that equates to happiness, and that's your response within the survey.
Yeah, so I get the point you're making. And I think probably of all the theories I presented, system justification comes closest to describing what you just said. And yet, I think this basically comes down to the weakness of surveys and capturing a lot of the nuance that I think you want captured here. You almost want a situation where people are strapped down in a hospital bed with electrodes all over their bodies, reading brain waves and heart flutters when they answer questions under truth serum, or a situation like that where you get something more closely approximating an honest answer, right?
I think the most interesting happiness study would be one where you bring people in and you got a camera going, and you ask them, so are you happy? And you get their answer. And at the same moment, you're capturing the crinkle of their eyys when they smile.
Yes.
And you're measuring and you're noticing the terms they use when they describe their life and checking that against, like what does that vocabulary indicate? And you're taking what they say and then what they do, how they act, how they behave, and all of those things go into the soup. And so, I think probably if there's a happiness study where you're calling people on the phone, you're not going to get very good data because you're leaving so much out of that question, and you're getting an answer back that seems simple on the surface, but is pretty complex at depth.
Yes. And it's interesting that the one study I cited that's remotely close to what you just said favors liberals, the study about the Duchenne smiling, a genuine smile or genuine emotion coming out in your Twitter feed, or they studied like the emoticons people use, and just concluded that liberals were across the board more genuinely happy than conservatives on those measurements.
Yeah, because I think in some circumstances, it's really hard to say that you're unhappy. Like you, Joe, you're married, you have 2 kids. If someone says, are you happy? And the first answer that comes up is, no, I'm not happy. What does that say about your marriage? What does that say about you as a father? Like, what does that say about these things that I've invested my life in? And how are people going to perceive me if I say having these things, I'm unhappy? All those things problematize the answer and make it more difficult to say you're unhappy.
Yeah.
I think if you're a member of a church and you say I'm unhappy, then what does that say about the church? What does that say about your soul? What does that say about your chance of ending up in heaven? Like these things problematize unhappiness in a way that just makes it much harder for Americans to say it.
Yes.
Which is why I tend to trust crinkles at the corner of the eye more than the words that come out of their mouth.
Yeah, or certainly this is an argument for context, right? Because I was just thinking about myself since you brought me up hypothetically. I would honestly tell an interviewer that I'm less happy today than I was a few years ago. Why? Because I lost my job a couple of years ago, and that's been a real body blow for me, But without that context, a researcher might conclude that I'm less happy because Donald Trump is president. But that has nothing to do with it whatsoever, Yeah. And that could really be misleading. If I'm part of a survey about how liberals are less happy, just assuming it's because of the political lay of the land and not other context.
Yeah. I also think it's hard for men to say they're unhappy. Like if you'd asked John Wayne if he was happy, he probably would have scoffed at the question because happiness has nothing to do with men. He would have thought that happiness is an effeminate quality. But today, probably there's a large number of men who would think saying they're unhappy is a confession of weakness in a way. Like that shows that you are not enough a master of your life to have grabbed happiness by the throat and shaken it hard enough that it becomes part of your life, It implies a weakness, a vulnerability that a number of men would be unwilling to admit. And I think that probably cuts across the political spectrum, but probably also shows up more acutely among conservatives.
And yet women say they're happier in all phases of their lives than men do. So, yeah.
Yep.
Well, this was a loaded question. That's my conclusion after researching it and after hearing all your vigorous pushback. This was really a loaded question.
Yeah. And what was interesting for me is I did not realize that it was a loaded question when I asked about it. I realized it was loaded when I started to do my own thinking about the topic, leading into the discussion.
Right.
So it was an accidentally loaded question.
Yes. Okay, well, I have a different kind of question for next time for you.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
I'm going to go out on a limb here, Mark, and say that this next question I'm about to give you might turn out to be your favorite question you ever received from me for this podcast.
Okay.
How about that?
All right.
And it's not even the one you're expecting about boxers or briefs. I know you're dying to answer that one.
Yeah, well, we're saving that for the final episode of Mansplaining, I know. I'm thinking, though, that it either involves artificial intelligence or which flavor of pie I think is the best.
It's neither, but I can tell you this subject is much closer to your heart and mine. It's about the beloved animals that both of us have in our apartments with us right now as we tape this episode.
Yeah.
Our dogs. Here's the question. What is it about dogs? That question has always seemed ineffable to me, incapable of being expressed in words, but I want you to have a go at it. Tell me the story of how dogs became humanity's most reliable and trusted companions and what accounts for the hold they have on so many of us.
Okay. Well, sometimes you ask me questions where it's like a blank page and I've never thought about it. I've thought about this many a time over the years. Dogs are one of my favorite things. So yeah, could be.
Yes.
This one will be a great pleasure to get into because I love the company of dogs.
I suspected as much, so I'm happy to send you off on that. And I, as a dog lover myself, I can't wait for that conversation.
Okay. Well, this is an easy correlation between this episode and the next one because the happiness studies say that companionship is very closely coordinated with happiness, and dogs provide us with companionship.
Yes. The ultimate companionship.
And dogs are also the happiest creatures that I can think of. Much happier than cats, for instance. Cats are miserable. Dogs are happy. So I will go off and I will look into the long, long history of human-dog companionship and correlation and how we've evolved side by side and come back with an answer for your question. And for our listeners, I hope that you connect with people and you think about the things in your life that you're satisfied with and that you do those things that make you feel correlated with happiness. And then coming back, feeling happy with things, swing back around in a couple weeks and listen to my answer to the next one. Until then, that was Joe, and this is Mark, and we'll see you soon.
We'll talk to you next time.
I'm a rock-ribbed conservative, and let me tell you, I have fun. I'm on top of the world, just don't touch my gun. I'm engaged in my community. We believe in equal opportunity for all of those American men who are straight, white, and born again. I'm very happy in my skin,
and all I do is win.
I never question it, so it must be true. Happiness is sticking to my point of view.
I'm a bleeding heart liberal. I'm drowning in the news. Every problem in the world feels like something else to lose. I'm working on myself, got a therapist on call. We're unpacking my feelings, examining them all.
I recycle my anxiety in a dozen different ways. I'm aware of every issue and miserable most days. I correct your terminology, then apologize twice for the tone I use correcting you.
I'm trying to be nice. I'm unhappy, can't you see? Dragged down by my empathy. Once I fix the world and make it new, then I can change my point of view.
Whether conservative or liberal, we and our descendants look down on independence. They're a pain in the pate that we can't help but hate. They refuse to pick sides,
Never fight,
they're bona fides.
bona fide.
Are they happy in their skin?
Even when they're not all in.
Can well-adjusted artisans
Be happy like us partisans.
we sincerely doubt it? There's no happiness without it.
Are you happy?
What a tidy little phrase, like it's binary and obvious, like it's something to display.
Does it mean that I am blissful? Or just that I'm content? Is my life so full of purpose? Does life match my intent?
If I feel unhappy,
Have I failed?
if I say I'm happy,
Do I lie?
will you believe me? Will you judge me?
Will you want to ask me why?
I'll give you what you're asking.
Keep it simple.
Keep it snappy.
It's the safest kind of answer.
I'm fine. I'm good. I'm happy. Are we happy? Hard to say. We pursue that word every single day. If it needs this much defending, is it true or just a vague idea that we're
Clinging to. Happy.
so happy? So happy.
So happy.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Best